and discussions that I think are relevant to much of our work in the foreseeable future. I'm not sure all the members joined us today, so why don't you, Rachel, just indicate what board members are currently online for this meeting, for the record?
Sure. Good afternoon. In addition to yourself and Vice Chair Kerwin, we have Dr. Stapleton, Dr. Doss, Mr. Manco, and Dr. Lynch.
Okay. And I understand our superintendent is on. Welcome. Please indicate the people who are with you, and we'll get started as soon as possible. Mr. Chaudhry?
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I am zooming in from Snow Hill Elementary in Worcester County. So they have been kind enough to give me a room. This is a school that had a 80% kindergarten readiness rate with a depth of poverty over 50%. There are schools moving the needle across our state. So I had to come. But I also have a presentation to you today, so I'm taking a break from the visit. I have a few people with me here today, just because I like to roll with a posse sometimes. And so I have Justin Dayhoff, who's our CFO at the department. I have Chandra Hazlett, Assistant Superintendent over our Accountability Assessment and Performance Reporting Division. Chandra has been department for a while now, but you know she needs to lead this work, and so she's new to the role but not new to the department. Matt Duque from her team is also here. He's our manager over research and program evaluation. And then I have Dr. Collins, Deputy Superintendent of Teaching and Learning. I have Phil Lasser, who's an Executive Director in the Office of the State Superintendent. And my special guest for today, I asked her if she could join me, is Dr. Daria Willis, who is the President of Howard Community College. And so she'll be my X factor for my presentation today. And so I invited her. She is most recently coming from Everett Community College that has been nationally recognized for doing amazing things for first generation college students. And when I say recognized, like legitimately recognized by Aspen and many others. And so I invited her today to co-present with me during one part of my presentation. But with that, I am ready to present when you are, as long as I can do I have access, Rachel, yet?
Yes, you should. You should have access.
But Chaudhry, let me thank you and your staff for working with us and Rachel over the last couple of months to get the comprehensive plan together. As we started this process, we recognized that there would be some bumps in the road, a number of disagreements and some challenges. But I think for the first time out and working through under some very tight time frame, lack of staff on our part, it really delayed due to some circumstances outside of our control. I'm very, very proud that we've been able to pull this off thus far. This does not in any way mitigate the challenges ahead, but at least it, as I like to say, it gets us in the water and moving in the right direction. So thank you, and thank your staff for all the work and all the consultation that you provided in this moving forward. So with that, Rachel, have to facilitate this for him, and we'll be ready to proceed.
All right.
You should be able to go ahead and share your screen. Great.
I think I'm sharing right now. Let me go into screen sharing mode. All right, there you go. Make sure I can move. All right. So thank you again for having us today. Got quite a few updates to you. Probably won't get to everything, but there are two things that I do really hope to get to. One is we have an update on where our work is right now when it comes to the college and career readiness study, as well as where next steps are with that. Wanted to brief you on the report that we submitted to you on the neighborhood indicators of poverty, a very important topic and issue near and dear to me. And then we were asked to brief you on the report on English learners that the work group recently did. Something I was honored to be part of right out of the gate when I started. And so My hope is we definitely get to 1 and 2. If we don't get to 3, I can hopefully come back and share with you about that. So with that, I'll jump right in. My team will help me throughout the presentation, and they'll jump in when we come to those portions of the slides. So really quickly, let's go ahead and jump into the CCR study updates. So as you know, the Blueprint for Maryland's Future sets a vision for setting a new CCR standard at the end of 10th grade. We want all of our students to be college and career ready. And there is a study that the department was charged with commissioning. And so we will share about where we are with that. The department also decided to do, this wasn't statutorily required, we wanted to do an exploratory study to begin to look at some early data, because we do have tons of data with our partners at the MLDS Center on what it could potentially look like. Again, the exploratory study is something we just did with Mark at UMD that is completed, and then the long-term study is the charge of the blueprint by September of 2023, and then of course the state board would adopt. A quick reminder, because it's always important for the public to be reminded of what the interim standard is. The law sets the interim standard. The interim standard, as you can see, is pretty much a reliance on standardized test scores, both the English and math, and it's a and approach. You're going to hear me say that intentionally. And then, of course, it also weaves in the SAT of 520, because there was an equivalency study done prior to my arrival to look at what that. So right now, any student in Maryland who met this interim standard were deemed CCR ready, while the long-term study is happening. And again, it is simply based on standardized test scores, and it's not an either or approach, it is an and approach, and both have to be true. In terms of the statutory context, I already gave you the overview. Again, the big thing here is for our public to be reminded, I don't have to remind you, but for the public, right, once the final CCR standard is set, after the study is done and we land somewhere, right, there is the line from the blueprint: each community college and other open enrollment public institutions and higher education shall accept for enrollment, right, in credit-bearing courses, right, basically what the new standard is. As you can see in the bottom, achieved college and career readiness according to the standard adopted by the State Board of Education. And so this is a very important point to remember, because it impacts our entire pre-K 12 through college and career system.
Mohammed?
Yes.
Yeah, could I just, I wanted to comment on one thing you said. It's not that, there's a nuance here. It's not that open admission institutions or community colleges would have to accept if they meet this standard. It's that the standard would be such that students could be successful in a non-credit bearing course.
Well, I believe the interpretation is except for enrollment, right? They have to actually, yes.
But
so
the assumption is that if they meet the standard, they are prepared to be successful.
Yes, but they also can't give them any remedial courses.
Right. No, I understand that, but it's not just that they're automatic. They have a gateway, and we don't know whether they're going to be successful. The standard is supposed to be such that they will be successful in the course.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So with that, I'll jump into the exploratory study we did, and then we'll talk about the long-term study and where we are and who we are contracting with to do the long-term study. So with that, I'm going to have Matt Duque from our Office of Research and Program Evaluation take over from here. Go ahead, Matt.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to share a summary of the exploratory study. Start with the 6 questions that guided the study. The first was around how should the measures be operationalized? Second question, what are the best predictors of success in post-secondary coursework? Third question looked at the actual levels on these measures that best predicted success. The fourth question looked at the interim CCR standard and how that aligned with success. And then the fifth question looked at there was any disproportionality of these measures by different student groups. And then lastly, we'll look at how multiple measures factor into predicting success in post-secondary coursework. So next we'll look at what are the measures that were explored in the study and how the study defined each of them. So the study examined the relationship between high school measures and post-secondary measures. So in the left box, we have the high school measures. There are three main categories here. One is GPA, second is college entrance exams, the third are the state standardized tests. So for GPA, the study looked at cumulative GPA, so up to the end of 10th grade, up to the end of 11th, and up to the end of 12th grade. For the college entrance exams, ACT and SAT scores were examined, both as composites and in individual subjects. And for the state tests, it was ELA 10 and algebra, which are the traditional high school tests. In terms of the post-secondary metrics on the right, first-year college GPA was used in two ways. So one on a scale from 0 to 4, and this is based on the students' first 30 credits they earned in post-secondary. And then using that, another measure of post-secondary success, which they defined as that GPA being of 3.0 or higher. Next slide, we'll look at the population of the study, and this give you an idea of, it started with, looked at 3 cohorts in terms of when they exited high school, and that would be in 2017, 2018, and 2019, and that was over 200,000 students. But in order to look at their outcomes in post-secondary, we had to whittle it down to 129,000 that attended specifically a Maryland public college or university, because those are the ones that have data available. And then in order to meet the 30 credit threshold, that whittles it down to 55,000 students. And you'll see on the right, those are broken out into about a quarter of them attending a 2-year college, primarily in this period, and 3/4 attending a 4-year college. And all the analyses going forward will be separated by whether they as a 2-year student or a 4-year student. In terms of the population, we'll look at the demographics. So the first column for all high school exiters gives you a sense of the demographics statewide. And then the next 2 columns for 2 years and 4-year college students shows if there were any differences, how representative of the entire population is this sample. So for example, the third row, we see white students represent 39% of these 3 cohorts, but over 48% of 2-year students and 45% of 4-year students. So generally we see the college enrollees in the study are more likely to be Asian or white and less likely to be English learners, students with disabilities, or students that are eligible for free and reduced price meals. So next, just give you some high level takeaways from the study before we go into the details and the actual numbers. The first high level takeaway is that high school GPA and the state ELA assessment specifically were found to be the strongest predictors of first-year college GPA. The one difference between 2-year and 4-year students in this finding is that for 4-year students, college entrance exams were stronger than for 2-year students. The second main takeaway here is that high school GPA was a little more precise in predicting first-year college GPA than the other measures. The third point is around the student group impacts. And we see there are differences in terms of which students, specifically Black and Hispanic students, compared to Asian and white students, and students eligible for free and reduced price meals, being less likely to meet the cut scores identified in this study. The last main takeaway here is around multiple measures, and we find, or the study found, that it would increase the number of students identified as CCR. So allowing for an option for students to meet the standard, either through assessments or GPA, increases the number of students meeting the standard, but is still exceeding this definition of post-secondary success. So getting into the specific questions, first round, how should measures be operationalized? Generally speaking, the more information in a measure, the better predictor it is. So some examples are adding multiple years and subjects makes the predictor stronger. Look at GPA, for example, or for college entrance exams, they're better predictors than if you just look at, say, SAT math or SAT reading by itself. Similarly, if you aggregate high school GPA over multiple years, it's a better predictor than looking at a specific course, like what grade a student received in math or science. And then lastly, high school GPA over multiple years is a better predictor than looking at just 1 year or 1 or 2 years.
Can I just ask a super quick question? When you
Sure.
say GPA, are you talking straight GPA or are you talking a QPA?
So for this study, GPA was used, you're talking about a high school, so they only looked at ELA math and science.
But is it I guess my question is, was it weighted by, like in some situations, if you have an AP course,
Right.
your GPA is weighted differently? Was it just a straight GPA regardless, or was it a weighted GPA?
I believe for high school it was not weighted, but the college were weighted by the number of credits.
Thanks.
So the next question was, so which of these measures are the strongest predictors? And if you look at the table below, you'll see the 7 measures that we outlined at the beginning, and then their correlations between these measures and students' first-year college GPA, in both 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges. The correlations in green are highlighted because they stand out as being above the other measures correlations. So you'll notice for 2-year colleges, we see GPA and ELA 10 specifically not being a lot of difference between them, but being higher than the college entrance exams and Algebra 1 test. And then 4-year colleges, there's a lot of similarity between all the measures except for Algebra 1 is slightly lower. I would point out that this is likely because Algebra 1 is taken several years before these other measures. So ACT, SAT, ELA 10 are usually taken 10th, 11th grade, whereas Algebra 1 can be taken in 7th, 8th, or even 9th grade. So the more time you put between these measures, the lower correlation we see. So in addition to how strong the predictor is in terms of correlation, the study also looked at how precise is it in predicting student success. So in order to do so, the researchers mapped each of these measures to students' first-year college GPAs, and they came up with these threshold scores. So you'll see, for example, grade 10 GPA, which is the first row in the table. It shows that of students that had a grade 10 GPA of 2.68 or higher and attended a 2-year college, 2/3 of them earned a 3.0 first-year GPA or higher. You'll notice that the first 3 rows for GPA are highlighted because their precision in these measures in predicting first-year GPA is higher than the college entrance exams or the state standardized tests. And we see the same pattern for 4-year colleges. We do see higher precision for 4-year than for 2-year students. The next question is around disproportionality of impact for these measures on students. So the first look is for 2-year colleges. The bar graphs below there's a lot of information there. So to summarize it, as I mentioned earlier, the Black Hispanic students are less likely than Asian white students to meet the cut score across all the high school measures. So regardless of those college entrance exams, a state standardized test, or the GPA. So we look across groups, but also within groups. So the second takeaway here is white students are more likely to meet the measure through either college entrance exams or the standardized tests at the state level than through GPA. And then if we look at students eligible for farms, at least for the 2-year colleges, we do see them more likely to meet the threshold through GPA than the alternatives. For 4-year college students, we see the same patterns. The only difference is we found a disparity for four-year students for farms measures, where we did not see that for four-year colleges. So that's on the next slide, if you could advance.
Could I interrupt for just 1 second?
Sure.
Make sure I fully grasp what you're saying here. And let's take the first category, grade 10 GPA, and the SAT 110. Are you measuring or analyzing those students separately? But I would assume many of those are the same students, aren't they?
These are the same students. What the figure is showing is the percent of students that are meeting this threshold that was established by the study for post-secondary success. So for example,
okay,
sorry.
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, sorry.
So just if you look at the figure below, so starting all the way on the left, so our first orange bar shows that 85% of Asian students met that threshold on the SAT test. If you move over to the next block of bars for Black students, only 38% of Black students met that threshold. So we're identifying there's a disparity in by race ethnicity in terms of meeting the SAT threshold.
No, that's not the question I'm asking.
Okay.
I'm trying to, because it goes back to the central portion of your question, the outcome. The outcome based on what you indicated earlier, and I'm not questioning, I just want to fully understand it, that you have a greater predictability with the GPA. And as I'm looking at the measures here, that is measured at grade 10. And then I go down below and it says basically that if I look at a student with the SAT score separately, I get a certain level of percentage that earn 3.0 or above first year in school. I'm trying to figure out whether or not that is the same or could be the same student, so that I'm trying to determine which is the more valuable predictor. Because if I'm the student that has scored fairly well in SOT, I'd probably be the same student that did very well at the end of the 10th grade.
Right, so this particular slide is regardless of post-secondary outcome. It's only looking at how students fare on the high school measures by student group.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. The next question is around how the results align with the Blueprint's interim standards. So first for math, using the Algebra 1 standard, if we look at the figure on the right, the study found that for two-year college students, the threshold was a score of 745. The black bar represents the interim standard of 750. So the 745 identified by the study is just below that. So that suggests that the interim standard slightly under-identifies CCR students in Algebra 1. And just to give you some context, in 2019, over 3,600 students scored between 745 and 749. So they would have met what the study determined was a minimum threshold, but not have met the CCR interim standard. For four-year college students, it was a lot closer. The study identified a 751, so it was only 1 point higher than the interim standard. But for context, there's still 869 students that scored 750. So they would have met this interim standard, but not quite met what the study identified as a threshold. So that's for algebra.
Matt, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
That when it says map to first year college GPA of 3.0, is that like across all of the credit bearing courses, not just math courses?
Yes.
Thank you.
So that's for, that was for math. Now we're looking at ELA.
Hey, Matt, I
Yes.
apologize, but
That's
you,
fine.
you may have said this earlier, but let's say go back to the previous slide if you could. So let's say somebody gets a 745. What you're saying that maps to a 3.0 in the first year of college at a two-year school.
Correct.
When you say it maps to that, what percent of this, and maybe you've already said this, but what percent of the students who scored 745 actually got a 3.0?
Yes.
You understand my question?
Yes, I was just finding the numbers, 59%.
So, I mean, does that mean, is that a good, in other words, what is a good measure? If only
Right.
59% are getting a 3.0, is that really mapping to a 3.0? Wouldn't we want 75% or 80%?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's more than 50, so it's more likely than not, but right, at some point it's subjective. So, but then we also have like the whole false positive dilemma. So
Yeah. I just
but in
worry that
terms
we have a standard which what you say maps to 3.0, but there's too high a percentage of students aren't actually getting the 3.0, even though they meet that standard. So anyway, we have to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Britt, I had a similar reaction. I would like in the full study, it would be helpful to understand the thought process behind the outcome. So greater than a 3.0, you know, how is that defined as success in college? And maybe 3.0 is high, or you know, should it be specific courses? And then, you know, what is considered when we're defining these thresholds, what is considered acceptable? Is, you know, would we want 80%? Would we want 67%? Just, I think more information about that would be really helpful.
Sure, and the next part we will talk about the full study, and I believe they're going to look at some more measures on the post-secondary side than the exploratory study did. So hopefully those will be addressed. For the ELA standard, the study found the scores that mapped to a 3.0 were slightly higher than a 750, which was the interim standard. So a 756 specifically for two-year college students and a 757 for four-year college students. So, and you can see above each that about 3,000 students score between the interim standard and the identified threshold, and about 4,000 students score between the interim standard and the identified threshold for four-year students.
Matt, Jennifer Lynch has her hand up
Okay.
for a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how far, like, what is the scatter around that number? I guess, you know, how tightly do they hang in together? And I guess the point that I'm sort of getting at is, do we have a lot of students who are, is there a lot of variability? We have a lot of students who are not meeting Park standards, but they are still getting 3.0s, but then we have a larger percentage. You know, how tightly are all of these numbers hanging together in what you're representing?
Right. I don't have that in front of me right now. But as you said, like, for example, the 59%, we'll show you some numbers in the next few slides where you'll start to get at that. Might be. So far, we've looked at individual high school measures. The next few slides, we're going to look at how predictive some combinations of measures are. So for this first look, so in the first table, we see 4 outcomes here. So the student can meet their interim standard by scoring a certain level in ELA 10 and Algebra 1. And in the study population of two-year college students, there were almost 4,000 students that met that criteria. Their average first-year GPA was 3.15, and 62% of them had a 3.0 or above. See below the other categories. So in the fourth row are the students that did not score at the interim standard for either ELA 10 or algebra. And you can see their first year GPA on average is much lower, and it's a little above half the percent that met that 3.0 threshold compared to students that met the interim standard. Similarly, we see the same trend for four-year college students, where you focus on the last column. 78% of students that met the interim standard in both assessments had a first-year GPA of 3.0 above, while only 36% that did not meet the interim standard did so.
Matt, am I reading the numbers correctly that it looks like when we're doing sort of when we're looking at the GPA, that students are more successful in four-year colleges in terms of correlating GPA to success than in two-year colleges?
That's correct.
But it seems like, okay.
So that's for the interim standard. Next, we look at GPA by itself. So these tables compare for two-year and four-year college students that met the GPA threshold identified by the study. So it's 2.74 for two-year college students and 2.83 for four-year college students, against students that did not meet this GPA threshold. And you can see again, if you focus on the column all the way to the right, that it's about twice. Students that met the GPA threshold are about twice as likely to earn that 3.0 first-year college GPA than students that did not meet the high school threshold.
Why are the GPA thresholds different?
They're calculated based on the sample of students. So two-year college students were analyzed separately than four-year college students. The next slide looks at how well the interim standard, which we looked at first, compares to the GPA threshold. So again, if you focus on the column all the way to the right, you see the percentages of students scoring above 3.0 are pretty similar. But if you look at the first column, you notice that the number of students identified is slightly higher when looking at GPA as compared to when looking at the assessment standards. And then finally,
Matt, can I just spend just 1 second? Because I just want to make sure that I'm clear. Because I'm not sure that it's apples to apples. If we had different sort of cut scores for GPAs from 2 to 4 years, it seems like we're not being equally comparative. So can you just talk to me a little bit more to kind of understand that element?
sure. So that was a decision made by the researchers based on differences in these populations. However, I would say, I think here it is okay because we're not comparing across types of colleges. The comparisons here are within the sample. So for example, the first table is two-year colleges. So we're making the comparison on their high school measures within that sample, and then the same for within four-year college students. But I think certainly for the long-term study, that's something we look at because we likely would want one standard for all students. So we don't necessarily know where they're going to go when they're in high school.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. And I think just to be able to look at if we're talking about percentage, if we're talking about sort of mapping out success rates, I would think we would want, sort of a uniform metric.
Yes, but at the same time, I think it's also instructive that there are different outcomes and relationships based on the type of student where they're going to be aware of. And then
Dr.
sorry.
Sorry, Matt, Dr. Doss
Sure.
has a question.
Yeah, and maybe I'm still part of Jennifer's question because I'm trying to determine why do we have the comparing of the 2-year and the 4-year colleges? And maybe you just have to tell me that in a different way.
Yeah, so I
Does-
wouldn't compare them here. I wouldn't compare 2 and 4 year. The comparison is
Okay.
within the type of college. So here the comparison is students that met the GPA threshold and like versus students that met the assessment standard within the type of college to see how predictive they are. Although here I should note that these 2 groups are not mutually exclusive in terms of which standard they met, because a student could meet both in GPA and assessment.
Okay.
So it kind of gets complicated.
And then I guess what is that really supposed to tell us? Are we supposed to, based on the data, infer something about students who are attending 2-year or students who are attending 4-year or students who, I mean, there are a lot of variables in there when we
Right.
talk about the 2-year, 4-year. So are we supposed to infer something, or the slides later going to sum that
Sure.
up? Or
Well, we have one more slide, but to this slide, the takeaway is that the interim standard is very similar in terms of the outcomes of students that meet the standard with if there was a GPA threshold, at least as identified by this study.
Mhm.
But you can see a GPA threshold would identify more students than just the assessment standard. And I
Okay.
see Jennifer and Joe have their hands. I think Jennifer was first.
Yeah, I have one more sort of question looping back, because when you said sort of the types of students, so is there a way that we determine what that type, like what when you say type of student, what are the qualifiers or characteristics that you're using to determine what the type is?
I believe I meant in terms of the type of college, whether 2-year, 4-year, but that wouldn't, obviously we would not know that until they enrolled.
Thing.
Mr. Manko?
Yeah, and I guess my question is probably pretty similar to Ike's earlier in the session, but I think it's more clear on this slide. And it's more or less, of these, 22,000-ish students that are meeting the standardized testing benchmarks for 4-year colleges, how many of those students are included in the 25,000 who are meeting the GPA threshold? And, it's ultimately what we're saying, there's 3,000 students, assuming that those students, that there's a pretty tight correlation between students that are meeting the ELA and algebra testing threshold, and there's a tight correlation between those individuals and students that have these higher GPAs, is more or less what we're seeing. There's about 3,000 students that aren't able to pass the test. But if we were to look at them just based on meeting this GPA threshold, they are shown to be successful when, when they enter a 4-year college.
That's correct. I'd say there is a strong correlation. I don't know how, I'm not sure about tight. If you don't mind, I think we'll get into some of those numbers in the next few slides. But you're right. So for 2-year colleges, it would be, I think, 1,700 additional students. And then 4-year colleges, another 3,000. So we're talking 4,000 or 5,000 students for the study. So the next slide adds another layer too. So the study simulated sort of 4 different options for CCR. So if we look at the first table for 2-year colleges, the first row shows number of students and average first-year GPA for students who met the GPA threshold and scored at the interim standard in ELA 10 and algebra. And you should note that they result in the highest of these options I'm going to show you, highest average GPA and highest percent above 3.0. The next is the interim standard, so meeting ELA 10 and Algebra 1 scores. The third is GPA, which we just looked at by itself, regardless of how they do on the test. And then the fourth row shows an or situation where they can meet this interim standard in ELA 10 and Algebra 1 or the GPA threshold. You should notice a few things here. One, the number of students varies a lot. So this last option gives us the most students identified. But there certainly is somewhat of a trade-off between number of students identified and their outcomes in post-secondary. So we see that the average first year GPA is lower compared to the first row and the last row, and the percent at or above 3.0. However, I should point out that at least for two-year colleges, the interim standard, which is the second row, produces an average first-year GPA of 3.15, and that's very similar to that last option of 3.14. The general takeaway here, though, is allowing for this option between GPA or the assessments increases the number of students. And while there is a difference in the outcomes, it still exceeds this post-secondary success definition on average. So if there are no questions here, I'll pass it back to the superintendent.
All right. So my connection here is somewhat weak. So if I freeze, Matt, take over.
Okay.
Or Sean.
Mr. Superintendent, can I just take one? I'm sorry, if I could just have
Okay.
the privilege of just 1 second and go back to the previous slide. I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure that I'm sort of looking and understanding this correctly. So if we say GPA or performance on a standardized assessment, when we look, the average GPAs of these students all end up in college, all end up being over 3.0, regardless of the metric we're using. So if getting in, so the percentages go up from 61 to 75% get over a 3.0, but I guess what I'm just trying to make sure that I understand, it doesn't look like the gain, like if you're just using GPA, kids are still going to college and getting over a 3.0. The majority of them, is that
On average, yes.
Correct,
okay.
on average.
I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that slide correctly. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Wanted to shift to, in the department, we really like benchmarking our work around what's happening across the country and internationally. MDRC is really the leading organization nationally looking at student success and predictors when it comes to college and career readiness. And they're beginning, the research consensus is beginning to come around multiple measures at placement systems. And essentially what colleges are doing more and more, and you are seeing this happening across the country, is they are using a set of business rules, right, to place students into credit-bearing courses using multiple measures. And those multiple measures have like a set of decision bands, right? If this, then this. If not, then look at this, and if that's true, then that, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like if we just take our sample from the interim study. But MDRC has done a lot of great work. A lot of RCTs have come out of this work to shape it. And so just taking the two-year college students, right, just that sample of students from our interim study, right? If the student met the interim study, yes, put them into credit-bearing courses, right? If they didn't, right, that was another 7,900 kids, almost 8,000 kids, right? But did they meet the GPA threshold? And say you set a GPA threshold, and if the answer is yes, that's another set of kids, right? We're looking at another 3,100 kids who would go into credit bearing courses. And then this is where kind of this new frontier is happening. And we want our long-term study to really dig into this, is if they didn't meet interim standard based on the standardized test score or the GPA threshold, is there another measure? For us, it's a question mark here. Other colleges across the country, community colleges, are beginning to fill that or try things out. And so, so if yes, you met the other measures, then you put them into credit bearing courses. If not, then you go into, right, whether it be a concurrent enrollment approach or remedial courses. Here's what it looks like with four-year colleges. Again, we had 22,000 kids, about 56.5% who met the interim standard. There was another almost 17,000 kids who didn't. But if we just used a GPA threshold, we would have identified another 7,000, almost 700 set of students who would, right, on average, have predictive value to be able to pull off a 3.0 GPA in college. And then again, right, there's another set of students who didn't meet both, but is there this other measure bucket as well? So just something to think about as we think long-term about where to set this standard, and is it gonna be a single cut and that's it, or is it going to be a decision band approach where equally those things have predictive value? Is it going to be an or approach, or is it just going to be this and that's it? So just, I mean, we're not going to answer that today, but that's just something to think about. This is just a summary of just all those measures that Matt talked about. It's just on one slide. I want you to know it's there. You have a copy of the slide, the public does. And then I'm going to keep pushing forward to our next chapter of the presentation. But I can stop here if there's any other questions. We are almost at an hour, Rachel, so you got to let me know if we're just going to stop. So since we're doing the approach of just doing questions right during the slide.
Let me interrupt. We've peppered you with a lot of questions, so we're going to adjust the time accordingly. So we'll see how we go from here. Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Lynch has her hand up.
Okay. If I freeze, Matt and Chandra, you know what to do.
This is exactly the slide that I wanted to be on. Thank you so much. Superintendent Chaudhry, am I correct in understanding that if we were going to decide who was eligible for CTE programs, apprenticeships, dual enrollment, that in this model right now, if we were using single cut scores, that we would have 16,000 students who would not be eligible for any of those out of this, in this sort of measure, that we would have 43% of students would not be eligible for any of those services or opportunities?
I want to say this carefully because Rachel, back me up or clarify here. If 10 years from now and we set the blueprints implemented and the CCR standard is in place, and if we go by the statement that in order to meet, you have to meet the CCR standard in order to jump into pathways, if that's what that is, then yes, that's what it could be like, right? That's assuming that approach, right? That's assuming that, you know, pathways, the gateway to pathways, I hate using that metaphor, but that's essentially, we say that the CCR is sent, and going forward 10 years from now, or whatever that threshold is when the blueprint is declared implemented, then all kids can only go to pathways once they've met the CCR standard. So the answer is yes to that. Rachel, do you want to add anything? Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, that's correct. I mean, when that determination is made is you know, is an open question, but ultimately, yes.
Okay.
Just keep in mind for these actual numbers, this is based on the study, which only looked at students that attended post-secondary. So it's not the full universe of students.
Right. Dr. Stapleton?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment of just a concern that I hope that folks watching this do not assume that having a GPA of 3.0 or higher in post-secondary in the first 30 credits should be or is the measure of success in course taking in, you know, entry-level college courses. So I would love to have a longer conversation at some point about how we're going to define, or how MSDE will be defining that.
Yeah, we're going off of what nationally all of the RCTs and predictors are looking at, and getting a 3.0 is pretty strong in finishing college, likelihood of finishing college. It's like a freshman on track indicator. If we want to set it higher, we could, but at the end of the day, when they're looking at first generation college students, especially, being able to pull off at least a 3.0 means you are greater likelihood to finish. You can increase that weight, but that just means you're going to create less and less kids who are deemed ready.
Yeah, actually, I wasn't thinking about increasing it. I was just thinking, what is successful completion of entry-level college coursework? And there are several many students graduate with less than a 3.0 in college.
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
is it setting it too high?
Yeah. Oh, you can go as low as like 2.75 and others. I want to bring Dr. Willis in because she has to meet with an elected official at 2:00. And so I want to bring her in to share some of the work they did in Everett College. And I'm actually going to jump to Everett College. This is perfect because Dr. Stapleton talked about setting it too high. And I want you to see what Everett College did. They brought it lower than a 3.0. And that's where she was president before coming to Howard Community College. So Dr. Willis, can I get 5 minutes of your time, or tell the elected official to wait a little bit so they can ask you questions too, please?
Graham, can you let Dr. Oh, wait, I got her. There we go. Are you, do we have
My
you?
apologies. Can you all hear me? I just lost signal
Yes.
on my main computer and freaked out and jumped on my laptop. So thank you for bearing with me in that moment. And thank you, Superintendent Chaudhry, for the invitation. Prior to my arrival at Howard Community College in January of this year, I was the president at Everett Community College in Everett, Washington, where we use multiple measures and namely GPA to place students into their English classes using the GPA of 2.5 or higher, and really looking at the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade years. And just for a moment, a point of clarification for you, just to note that Everett Community College is part of a national network called Achieving the Dream, which is a national organization dedicated to helping community colleges get better at things like placement and student success. And so there are a network of 1,100 community colleges across the country, and Everett Community College was only one of 32 community colleges within the nation to be named a Leader College of Distinction for moving students, particularly Black and Hispanic students, through their coursework successfully, inclusive of student parents, our older student population, and your traditional age population of students. But not only just with Everett, also at Howard Community College, where I'm currently have the pleasure of serving. I recently pulled our data in terms of GPA calculations, and we also use GPA to place students in college level English. So for semesters starting with the fall of 2020 to the spring of 2022, our data shows that when we place students into English 121, or the first credit level of English that a student will need, 86% of those students were successful. And we define success as achieving an A, B, or a C grade in that class. So that was about 1,800 students. And that represents that 86%. Now, when you look at other measures, such as looking at the SAT, or even our own in-house program, which our faculty call it the GSP, and it's something that the faculty here created, they saw a 64% success rate in comparison to the ones who were placed with the GPA of 86%. And I just want to also mention before I have to head out that Black and Hispanic students, as you all are aware, are disproportionately represented in developmental classes, especially when they have to take standardized tests to get placed into those dev ed courses. And I want to give you one quick example that I know a student who recently attended a previous college and was placed into developmental courses, not by using her GPA, but through the basic standardized test process. She was forced to take developmental classes, and she did not reach her credit-bearing courses for an entire year. When she moved to a new college, they instead evaluated her not on the developmental classes that she was taking, but they went back and looked at her high school GPA from 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. She was immediately enrolled in credit-bearing classes and is near graduation. And that student is my own daughter. We just moved here and she's doing well. And I'm using that as an example, not to say, you know, of course I'm a president, but as a parent, watching my student go through the process, being placed in developmental when I knew she had the ability to do the courses. When we moved here to Howard, they looked at her GPA and she's in credit-bearing courses and has earned above a 3.0 GPA. She's just one representative sample of that 86% that I talked about earlier. And I do think that multiple measures, the use of GPA, is the standard that many colleges are taking to evaluate our students into credit-bearing courses.
Dr. Willis, can you take one question? I think Dr. Das wants to share something from one community college colleague to another.
Thank you. Just one question. Dr. Willis, it's very good to see you. In the example that you gave about the 86% with the GPA, can you just clarify, was that just GPA or was that with grades and English courses in high school? Or
that is just GPA.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I can share this data with the superintendent so you can have a copy of it if you want to reference it.
Yes, that would be great.
I just urge you to invite our community college presidents back and just do whole sessions with them. So thank you so much, Dr. Willis. I really appreciate it.
Time.
Thank you. I'm going to zoom past the national context. You guys can look it up, and I'm going to go to the long-term study. But just what had Dr. Stapleton had shared, you know, 3.0 is one cut point. You saw in our study, you could even go as low as 2.75. At the end of the day, what success point do we want to mark it at, right? And then you heard from Dr. Willis and her time in Everett College and what that did. So the number, you know, at a certain point, you pick a number, right? Versus having several different cut points. I want to skip past all the national context and go to the long-term study. Since we have, you know, we have officially contracted with the organization, I'm going to have Chandra Hazlett from our assistant superintendent take it from here, so you guys understand where we are with the long-term study. So,
good afternoon, everyone. So next slide, just to provide a background in regards to the scope of the research study. So we have contracted with an external research organization to conduct the empirical study of the skills, knowledge, and abilities needed to succeed in the first year of Maryland Community College coursework. There are two main parts of this, this empirical study. One is a quantitative study, and the second part is a content and standards alignment study. As was presented earlier in regards to the quantitative study, the expectation is that the long-term study will definitely dig into further that relationship between the interim CCR standard and the student readiness to succeed in entry-level credit, as well as explore the additional possible measures of student readiness beyond that standard interim CCR with a variety of measures such as GPA, credit attainment, CTE, or a combination. Going into that second part, the content and standards alignment study, this is intended to be a deep content analysis to determine the levels and types of literacy in reading, writing, and mathematics that are needed to succeed in entry-level courses, explore the alignment of the Maryland College and Career Ready standards to the content of entry-level credit-bearing post-secondary courses and training, and to the content of remedial post-secondary courses. And finally, ending with an examination of the top performing educational systems throughout the world and consider potential sources of bias. Next slide. So the timeline and process that we have been working through. So we did put out a competitive sealed proposal. We went through a very competitive process. MSDE released the request for proposal on May 16th. Going further than just releasing, we actually sent out copies of the solicitation notice to 43 prospective vendors, including 6 from Maryland. It closed, the proposals needed to be submitted by July 14th so just this summer. 5 proposals were received from researchers across the country. There was an evaluation committee of MSDE and local education agency staff members that evaluated each proposal on technical merits. And we also met with each of the proposal firms individually. And then the technical evaluation was completed, combined with a financial evaluation. And on November 16th, the Board of Public Works approved the recommended contract. And so the contract is being awarded to the American Institutes for Research, AIR. They have been selected and approved to conduct the long-term CCR standards study. Some highlights in regards to the proposal submitted. It was determined to be the most advantageous. They demonstrate a superior understanding of the work required. They were able to provide specific details as to how they would satisfy the state's requirements. They had a strong background with related experience, and they had a very concise project timeline and a solid plan for meeting the expected deliverables. We just completed actually our official kickoff meeting on December 1, and we will continue to serve as a partner with frequent meetings to ensure that the project kind of stays on task and there are no issues that need to be resolved. So obviously we will be sharing with AIR the summary and some of the information from the exploratory study to give them a foundation to continue with their work. And they are focusing on engagement with community colleges. We are in conversations around gearing up that work. And as specified in the blueprint, the plan is that AIR will submit a final research report to the governor, the Maryland General Assembly, the AIB, and MSDE on or before September 1, 2023. So I wanted to provide a high-level working timeline. We've just kicked this work off, so some of these are kind of being finalized, but these are the major items that we can expect to complete over the next 10 months or so. We do anticipate they will have access to data in early January. We are working with MLDS Center to get them set up to have access to data. I do want to highlight that the focus groups is highlighted as gearing up in early next year, but extending as needed. We are planning on rolling out multiple opportunities for engagement, whether it's webinar surveys, in-person meetings. And I want to highlight that there's an interim report both for the quantitative study and the qualitative study with the final report in September.
I wanted to, Chandra, did you have one other point? Sorry, I wanted to make sure.
No, I was going to pass it back over to you because I know you wanted to talk about this first.
Hey, Chandra, go
So
ahead.
we have questions.
I just wanted to ask a quick question of Chandra.
Sure.
Thank you for this. For the conduct focus groups, can you remind me who that is with? At the MAG conference, I heard from interested parties and the LEAs who were really anxious to provide input, given their experiences, especially during COVID, of how they see students being successful or not successful. Or is that just me?
So we are still working on laying out all the roadmap for what is going to be involved with that that engagement. It is definitely going to be more than community colleges. We are anticipating opportunities with workforce, post-secondary folks, as well as our LEAs. And we should have a solid plan solidified early in 23. We definitely want to make sure we include everybody that we can.
Thanks.
I have a question, Chandra. So
Yes.
if let's assume we're going to get the report the 1st of September next year, when would we be in a position to implement the new CCR based on that study?
That's what I want to talk to you about in the next set of slides to understand what it takes. Yeah.
All right. And then one other question I had is, let's suppose the study demonstrates that there is some misalignment between the expectations in college for entry-level courses and the curriculum. in the pre-K through 12 schools. Will this be this? Will they be brought into better alignment through work of MSDE and the LEAs? In other words, what will there be some? If we find there's a misalignment, will this then become a project to create the right kind of alignment for these entry-level courses?
I would love to hit the next slides. It will explain to you how that goes.
Please, okay, if you're answering that, please go ahead.
You let me do that. All right. So couple things. I think everyone needs to, and this is a conversation we're not going to solve today, but we need to come to understanding what is the new CCR standard going to be. We have gone from Maryland's old standards to the Common Core era to the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standard. And so now we're saying the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standard post Common Core era is also not, if the premise is, if those standards are not also rigorous enough or not aligned, then, and if the premise is that we are going to, so there's two premises. One is we need to set a GPA cutoff. Our standards are aligned. Our standards are good. It's a matter of which assessments and GPA, what kind of measures we want to use to deem a student college career ready. Another premise is where you were going at, Britt, which is saying that, oh, the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards, which is a multi-year process to adopt, along with the assessments that go with it, are not rigorous enough. This is the post-Common Core standards, which are rigorous standards. If we're saying that they're not aligned, then I wanted the AIB today to see how many years it takes to change a test, to adopt new standards and such, because we are talking through the entire time period up until the blueprint of the 10-year period. And so, and until new curriculum and new standards and new assessment set. If that's one premise that this study wants to move forward with, or we assume our standards are strong, it's a matter of determining which assessments and which cut points in GPA to give kids more opportunities. So I wanted Chandra to talk to you about the length of time it took to transition Maryland from all the different transitions that have happened over the last several years through the Common Core era. Chandra?
Yes. Okay, so thank you. So I have two slides here. The first one is a historical perspective in that context and around what it takes to adopt new standards, new content standards, and then roll out assessments. So this is when we adopted the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards, and at a very high level in regards to the time period, we adopted the standards in June of 2010. We then went through a process where for 2 and in some cases 3 years, we were working on professional development around what those standards were. We had to provide a transition time for the district so that they could write new curriculum, they could purchase new curriculum, and more importantly, they needed to adjust the instruction in regards to what was being taught when. Then in 13-14, that's when we were able to roll out a new assessment. That was the PARCC assessment, which was field tested. And as a reminder, a field test means that there's actually no data available. So the test items themselves are being tested and there's no data available. Then in 2014-15, that's when we had in Maryland our first operational test for that ELA and math based on the content standards that were implemented in 2010. And again, as a reminder, when you go through that first year, you have to go through standard setting, and so there's a delay on the reporting. And in this case, I think the scores were released in December of 2015. So that is context in regards to what happened historically for math and ELA. An additional example I have is around the next generation science standards on the next slide. We adopted those standards in 2013. We went through several years where we, again, the professional development, writing the new curriculum, purchasing it, and adjusting that curriculum. And in this case in particular, Maryland actually worked on developing assessment items for the test during that time period. And then we rolled it out in regards to the field test and standard setting a little bit split, where we did 3, 5, and 8 science tests first in 2017, and the high school test followed in 2018. But all of those assessments had to go through a field test when no data was available, and then a standard setting process. So it's about the key takeaway for both of these slides is that it really is about 5 years if you are adopting new content standards, developing new assessments, and then rolling out the new assessment measure. There is a blue box on the next slide is the potential impact for standards and assessment transition. So this is just a potential. This is a hypothetical. If we are looking to adopt new college and career ready content standards after the long-term study is completed in 23, assuming that it gets adopted in 24, then MSD is working with LEAs on professional development, the curriculum, developing the new assessment, determining what standards are going to be assessed. Then we would field test in 2027 and standard set in 2028. The blue box.
Let me interrupt.
Yeah. Go for it. Yes.
All the timelines that you have, the way you've traditionally done this,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is accurate and is very helpful. But if we were to come up with a new standard and assessment transition, there's no way, shape, or form that we would do this over a 5 or 6 year period. That to me would be utterly incompatible with the urgency that we have before us, the urgency in which the General Assembly has adopted this legislation, and the needs that are out there. We will have to find ways in which to come up with an assessment standard adjustment that will be far sooner than that. This would be utterly a failure at all levels that we have to go through this process. That is the way we did it in the past. And that is the way it may be standardized in many places to do it. But that's not where we are today. We are post-pandemic. We're in a situation where things need to change, and we cannot rely upon traditional methods to do everything that we're talking about. There are some levels of risk involved here, but there's also some acknowledgement of the challenge that we face. And so for us to do this at this type of time frame simply would not be acceptable in my eyes. And I think we would have to come up with a different approach in which to address this. So if we were to do this, we might as well just stop. Wait this long process start. Thank you.
Respectfully, this is not something that's dictated by us. It's not a traditional mindset. This is dictated by federal law as well and processes. We can't just skip over federal requirements for standard setting and such. So I understand what you're saying, but even if I wanted to speed this up, there is no way to speed up a whole new adoption of new standards, field testing, test scores, standards, and there isn't. This is the speediest way what you're looking at. That's again, if we assume, I don't want to hold this conversation up with that, but if we could come back to address that, but there's no way for us to process this methodology in the time frame, the urgency that we are facing today. Even if what you're saying is true, that we are not or should not be committed to that, and we should challenge that because that is not acceptable. We will be languishing a huge, several generations of kids to absolute failure with this process.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't describe it as that, but that's fine. At the end of the day, this is assuming the premise that the Maryland College Career Readiness Standards that was adopted after the post-Common Core era is not rigorous enough. I would challenge us to think about that our standards are rigorous enough. It's more a matter of identifying the thresholds for our assessments that are rigorous, our GPA that we have not standardized yet, and using that to get kids into credit-bearing courses. I would challenge you to think about it in that way in terms of the CCR standard versus the adoption of Maryland CCR standard 2.0. But again, we can have that conversation, but that is something to think about. That changes the timeline.
The response you would get from anyone looking at that, if they are as rigorous as they should be, and as successful as they should be, then there would be no need for us to even have this discussion. And we're having it. Because the results uniformly belied that.
Yeah, but the results also are dependent on only standardized assessments. The results look a whole lot better if you begin to introduce other measures as well that define success. Right now, we are sticking just to standardized assessment. And so that's one thing to think about as we come to decide on what does the CCR standard mean? Is it a replacement of all of our standards, or is it setting new measures in addition to our existing standards that only rely on these traditional standardized test score approach to get kids into college? So something to think about, and just for you guys to think about long term.
Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a
No.
point of
Yeah.
challenge for me, so I apologize for that. Okay.
No,
Please.
absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Stapleton, do you have thoughts on this timeline, because you are a researcher and you understand cut point and setting? I just tell me if you think that there is some kind of one-year version of adopting new standards and whatnot, because I do not know of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if we find that curriculum alignment is not there between the college experience and the PK through 12 world, then yeah, we're talking a very long time to change curriculum, change teacher preparation, change the assessments. Assessment, field testing, and development is a long time process. I mean, yeah, if we throw a whole bunch of money at things, hire a lot of folks to get things done, then it can be done more quickly, but it takes time.
All right. Any other questions on this? Chandra, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think everybody has made some great points, and I will pass it back to you.
Okay. I'll just stop there. Rachel, should we come back? Because this was heavy as it is today, lots to think about. This next one is also brain hurting type conversations in a good way. So what would you like to do?
Mr. Chair, what would you like to do? Should we maybe spend is there a way to sort of do more of an overview of it, and then we could bring you back, or
On
to
this,
go deeper into it?
on this, just no. On this one, I just don't think we could there's 3 different methodologies. We have to sort school examples. It's just very difficult. There's no way we could just rush through it, and I can't.
We'll come back and pick, because it's too important to do rush-wise, and I want to give the superintendent and his staff and others an ample opportunity to go through this thoroughly. So I'd much rather do it right than to rush it.
Would it be possible to just hit the highlights of the EL work group, and then we could just bring you back to talk about the neighborhood indicators of poverty?
Sure. Can I trade out my team? Because I have I gotta go to my next school at 2:30. So I'm gonna have someone else screen share, and then Dr. Collins and Justin can do the EL work group as well if you would like. Okay.
That'd be great.
All right. So Justin, can you drive and then maybe give Justin's privileges? There you go.
Yep.
I see he's the co-host now.
While we're swapping out, I would like to say I had appreciated the opportunity to have a discussion about the CCR study. So I think it was time well spent.
Yes, thanks again.
Yes, indeed.
All right, Justin, you ready?
All set here. Can you all see the screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
Great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Deanne Collins. I'm the Deputy State Superintendent here at MSDE for the Office of Teaching and Learning. And I'm going to do my best, Rachel, just to provide some high-level updates on the work of the EL work group. So you can transition, Justin. So basically, as you know, the blueprint for Maryland's future identifies key expectations for the work group. Listed here, they are all noted. Collecting data on English learners, looking at methods of teaching and providing services, making recommendations on improving the education of English learners, and submitting a report. And so for the past almost 2 years, Mr. Chaudhary was the chair of this work group, and I supported him in facilitating monthly meetings around these key priorities. Next slide. The work group was very diverse. There were legislators, educators, stakeholders, advocates, university professors, experts within Maryland, but also across the country. We held 16 meetings. You can see over the course from 2021 to 2022. There was a guiding question that focused and centered the meetings. And there was also, we brought in a national perspective and a spotlight to align to that guiding question. And those national experts and researchers were able to help us authentically see experiences that would help us formulate some of the recommendations. We also had MSDE staff involved that provided an overview of what some of the existing practices that were happening across the state. And then we also provided time for community partners to provide input and discussion on the topics. Next slide. So just an overview of all the recommendations, and what I would just want to point out is we have highlighted in light blue some of the recommendations that were not included in the AIB's comprehensive plan. But the first 4 set of recommendations, one focusing on sustaining multilingualism as an asset. Number 2, that engagement and communication with multilingual families. Recommendation 3, focusing on a variety of different, I should say, instructional programs that support ELs. One that I'll highlight today is scaling the two-way immersion program, sometimes known as dual language. Also, number 4, looking at the assessment and accountability systems. And I'll focus today on just high level, the expanded ways to reclassify ELs. Next slide, Justin. Number 5, we looked at teacher preparation policies to support ELs. Number 6, identification support for young English learners. Number 7, looking at students with limited or interrupted formal education, also known as SLIFE. Number 8, the college and career readiness curriculum and pathways to support ELs. And then number 9, looking at funding allocations and decisions to support ELs. And again, number 9 was not included in the comprehensive plan, the AIB. So I'm only going to highlight just a few of the 9 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. But recommendation number 1 really focuses on looking at multilingualism as an asset. We talked about Maryland should implement and model an asset-based belief system, an approach that values English learners' home language and cultures, and really reframes the narrative, right? Not so much, not looking at language as a deficit, but as an asset. So trying to shift mindsets and beliefs around that. Also, the fact expanding the seal of biliteracy, and Maryland would align to this approach, and really just celebrating the power and the superpower of multilingualism. So here, I won't read all of these to you. I know that everyone has a copy of the presentation, but just high level, promoting strategies that confront the deficit mindset, shifting from English learner as a label to being more additive terminology. Again, I talked about that asset-based perspective and celebrating language. And we did look at some asset-based approaches nationally that were done in California, New York, and Texas. On the MSDE website, when the report was submitted to the AIB in November, a copy of the report is uploaded on our website so that when you have a chance, if you want to dive deeper into these national exemplars that we pulled out, you'll have an opportunity to do that. Next slide, Justin. In terms of recommendation number 2, we know that language can many times is a barrier for many families to access services and resources. So we want to make sure that language access facilitates better communication and great engagement between schools and families and communities to make it easier for English learners and their families to get support. So we focused on legislation or regulations to establish mandated language access policies. Again, looking at national exemplars around this work, looking at language access resource centers as an option, and also providing asset-based training for the department here at MSDE, but also with the LEAs as well. Again, there are some national exemplars in this work. New York has a really great framework that focuses on engagement and communication. Other states, Washington, and also right here in Prince George's County Public Schools, they established the Office of Interpretation and Translation. They have staff to support this. They provide language access resources. They provide training, just a very robust training and support that really is adding value to make sure that there's a high level of engagement and communication for multilingual families. So we could learn a lot and build upon what currently exists here in Maryland. Next recommendation is around scaling the two-way immersion programs. This was not included in the AIB's comprehensive plan, but research has shown that this strategy really does support academic and social emotional growth for second language students. And this is when students are taught both in their native language as well as with other partnering with other speakers. We want to make sure that that Maryland would have a model that would be phased in across the state. We would need to look at amending or supplementing existing statutory formulas around this, and also look at the state aid formula weights and make sure that there is dedicated funding for these programs. Currently in Maryland, we do have two counties, Montgomery County Public Schools, as well as Prince George's County Public Schools, that have scaled up the two-way immersion programs. Justin, you want to quickly talk about the funding aspect tied to this as well?
Sure. Just want to flag the particular challenge that districts currently face with regard to funding, which is that, and we actually did with the work group a braided funding activity around implementing some of these strategies and what that would cost and what that could look like with local education agencies. And one of the reasons that we call out funding in particular here associated with two-way immersion is that non-English learner students who participate in those programs are not currently eligible for the funding for the EL funding, right? They're not English learners, and so they don't meet the eligibility criteria in the law. And so between that and sort of the diseconomy of scale that can happen in some jurisdictions, systems who might want to implement a program like this do not actually have the funding they need to do that through the formula, because they can't use Title III funding on non-ELs, and non-ELs don't generate EL funding through the current blueprint formula. And so that's what we wanted to highlight here with regard to the statutory funding element.
Thanks, Justin. And again, there are some examples I mentioned on the work that Prince George's County Public Schools is doing. Next slide. Recommendation 4 focuses on transparent and equitable accountability and reporting for English learners. And so as the EL population in Maryland continues to grow and become more diverse, the accountability and data reporting procedures should evolve as well. We want to build an accountability and reporting system that's equitable, accurate, and very transparent to better understand the skill sets and assets that our English learners bring. So this is something that we think is very, very important. The work group thought that this was something that we should elevate, not just reporting outcomes for English learners to provide, one specific measure, but looking at multiple measures to really understand performance will be helpful. So we want to expand the public reporting to include progress and performance of ELs and reclassify English learners, make sure it's transparent and robust reporting, and ensuring that it provides comprehensive data on the achievement of English learners. Again, we've looked at some national exemplars about how they looked at shifts in accountability. And so we can definitely look at the work in Oregon and California. They've made some robust changes to their accountability systems. And right here in Maryland, in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, they have been examining their data at the county level and realized a need for a different approach to their accountability measures for our English learners. So they have made some shifts in their accountability measures in Anne Arundel County that we can tap into. Recommendation 4, this one also was not included in the comprehensive plan, but we wanted to make sure that we look at how to expand ways to reclassify ELs. Again, looking at the scores on the different proficiency tests that are used to determine how English learners exit from programs, but also how do we support them once they exit. So right now we only use one criterion to determine reclassification. So we want to look beyond that and really focus on multiple measures to reclassify ELs. Kind of a theme that we talked about earlier is having multiple measures than one data point to reclassify. Again, there we looked at some national examples. Next slide. California has a 4 criterion method that LEAs must use to reclassify. And also Pennsylvania has established a uniform process for reclassifying their ELs. Next. The next recommendation that we wanted to highlight is the Maryland Bilingual Teacher Certification. So contrary to the ESOL certification, the bilingual certification is not available in Maryland, but there are 20 states where it is currently available. So this is something that we wanted to look at. Basically, for Maryland to adopt a bilingual certification that ensures barriers are not limited to multilingual candidates, we would have to look at promulgating regulations. So it would be important that we involve the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board, also known as PSTAB. We have had conversations with PSTAB around looking at the bilingual certification and what it would take to develop that. So that's something we can develop in collaboration with PSTAB, and also work with our state board to determine what that would need to look like, excuse me. Again, California, New York, and Texas are just some examples where they have made some shifts in what a bilingual teacher certification program would look like that we could tap into. Next slide. Recommendation number 6 is focusing on the identification and support for young English learners. Currently, Maryland does not have a formal procedure for identifying young English learners. We know that very young learners, ELs, are very active in developing their home language. And we want to make sure that we are looking at what types of support we are putting in place very, very early on. So we need to prioritize this even from kindergarten. Again, not having a singular identification tool, but looking at multiple measures to have a comprehensive way to do this. We mentioned here the KRA, and I want to call out that we have been working on moving towards ensuring that the kindergarten readiness assessment, the KRA, can be administered in Spanish. And so again, there are some national examples, California, Illinois, New Jersey, that have specific alignments to looking at ELs in the early years that we can look into. And also right here, Baltimore City Public Schools has established a practice to provide English language development service for very young learners. As soon as they're identified, then they get into high gear to make sure there are specific supports for those students. And then looking at the college and career standard, as we know, it's kind of our North Star for the blueprint as a whole. So we want to make sure that the programs and supports really align together, but also that they are accessible to our English learners, as well as looking at how we identify students for gifted and talented students. So making sure that there are resources, very tangible supports and toolkits for LEAs, looking at measures, and also making sure that ELs are not unfairly limited as we look at different pathways, AP, IB, different classes that they can be a part of along their journey to be CCR ready. So this will be really, really important as we look at implementation. The EL work group looked at research that Massachusetts is doing, Texas, LA, and then right here in Anne Arundel County, Anne Arundel Community College and Anne Arundel County Public Schools designed a summer bridge program for rising seniors that's really helping to build their English proficiency so that they're likely to be successful. And then recommendation number 9. Justin, I'll kick it over to you, but this really gets into the funding allocations that we believe are necessary.
Sure thing, Dr. Collins, thank you. So this slide speaks to, what it would look like if Maryland were to essentially adopt the gold standard, if you will, in terms of potential funding avenues for allocating resources to English learners that are more comprehensive than the current weighting structure, which essentially assumes that English learners are a monolith, right? It is one weight for all English learners. And so what the recommendations in the report describe, and again, I'll point you to the full report for kind of the in-depth analysis, but to take it high level here, the first piece is just differentiating by English learner need, right? Again, not assuming that a newcomer English learner requires the same resources as an advanced English learner, for example. The other piece is, as some states have done, adopting additional funding to account for diseconomies of scale. And so, and that's something we see here in Maryland. Again, looking to Western Maryland, for example, where sometimes we only have a few students generating English learner funding for a school district. Those students are entitled to the services and require all of the services and costs and programming associated with their need. However, because of the small enrollment number of eligible English learners, they don't generate enough funding through the current formula to get them over the threshold to purchase an L coordinator or an ESOL para, or whatever those investments might be. One other item related but slightly different from diseconomy of scale is native language prevalence. And so the other piece is, not necessarily assuming that just because you're an English learner that you have the same needs from an ability or a level of language acquisition, but also that not all English learners are coming from the same home language. And so as different English learners and different concentrations of English learners are spread throughout the state in terms of their native language prevalence, that also makes an impact on how and in what ways schools and school systems deploy resources to serve those children. So for example, a classroom of 10 English learners with 10 home languages is very different in terms of how you provide services to those students than a classroom of 10 English learners who will all speak Spanish as their home language. And then last piece here, this references back to the earlier aspect and recommendation of the report with regard to the data around students with limited or interrupted formal education, but also accounting for the need that those students present in the formula, in part because students who are often transient or who have interrupted formal education don't necessarily make it into the count selections or the count days each year too. And so recognizing that and accommodating for those rates in the creation of and the way we allocate resources to ELs was part of our recommendation as well. And just in parallel to everything Dr. Collins just said, this, just like those, has we included references to other exemplars across the country and with regard to how and in what ways they're tackling some of these issues in their formulas, including, as I mentioned, those diseconomy of scale pieces to differentiated weights, as well as SLIFE, some of those other considerations. And with that,
Any questions?
Back.
I hate to get through this rather quickly, but we've had allocated an hour for this. We've gone an hour and 42 minutes now. And there may be some additional questions or concerns we'll be having at a later point, and we'll come back to those, especially on the models that will and how you formulate the costs associated with any of the changes that have been suggested here. Because if you do this at scale, it appears to be a fairly significant amount of money to most of what you've just suggested here. So we'll need to have a full discussion about, if we were to move in that direction, what would it look like and what would the cost implications be for the state overall? Rachel, are there any other hands or question raised here?
I do not see any hands.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I do now.
I just want to say I really appreciated the format of this report along with the recommendation. It gives us things to talk about amongst the board. Unfortunately, not today, given limited time, but as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
If there's nothing else, we're gonna briefly run into our executive session. I want to thank Dr. Chaudhry and his entire team for all the information provided today. It gives us a great deal to think about as we go forward. And we will come back in a later session, continue the discussion on a number of other important items that he was not able to get to today. Okay? With that,
Mr. Chair, before we go into closed session, if I could just give a couple of brief updates.
Sure.
So I just wanted to share that the comprehensive implementation plan is moving along. All the revisions based on the discussions at the December 1st meeting and further editing have been made, and they are with our design team who are working as quickly as they can to make it into a beautiful document. And we anticipate being able to post that version next week. We are have posted the revised version with all the changes made and no more track changes on the website under the implementation plan tab, just so it's available to folks until the final version is posted. And then we'll be having printed copies made and shared in January. So that's where we are on the comprehensive initial comprehensive plan. I also wanted to share that technical assistance sessions have begun with the LEAs starting last week, actually, and those will continue on through most of next week and then into January and February. And so these first sessions, MSD has been really walking through the template with the LEAs and seeking where folks need clarification or have questions around what they're being asked to provide. So they're sort of basic sessions for this first round of TA. And then on the outcome measures working groups, I wanted to share that we do have on the AIB website a link to a forum where anyone can either nominate someone to serve on the working group, one of the working groups, or nominate themselves. And we had initially planned on a deadline of December 20th, but in talking with Dr. Stapleton, we were thinking we might extend that to January 5th to give, since we're not necessarily going to be doing anything between now and then in terms of forming the groups, that would allow a little more time for anyone who's interested to submit their name.
Okay.
All righty, and then I think that actually covers it.
All right, we will adjourn from the closed session.
I apologize, Mr. Manco has his hand up.
Sorry about that. Just out of curiosity, Rachel, for the technical assistance sessions with the LEAs, what has the participation been like? Is this something where all the LEAs have been represented, or are we still kind of getting the word out and we have some LEAs that are not participating? And then typically, is it just the blueprint coordinators, or are they bringing teams? Are there teachers and on-the-ground staff that are represented at these sessions? What's the kind of dynamic?
So these are not optional sessions for the LEA. So ultimately, they will all be participating in. So they're organized around each pillar, and there are two opportunities for each pillar to participate. And the LEAs are specifically being asked to bring the folks who are involved in writing their blueprint implementation plan in that pillar area to the meeting, so that sort of all the right people are there to be hearing the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Any other further questions? If not, we're going to take 2 minutes and go right into our executive session, and we will adjourn from the executive session. Could you read a comment from us, Rachel, for us to move therefore?
Yep. So the motion would be to adjourn to executive session in accordance with the Maryland Open Meetings Act to consult with legal counsel and discuss the fiscal 24 budget.
Yeah, motion to that effect?
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay, moved and second. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposition? Hearing none, we will adjourn into executive session in 2 minutes. Thank you.